What was the Edwardian plume bloom? Was women's Edwardian hat fashion really called Murderous Millinery? And did they really push some of the most beautiful exotic birds from around the world to near extinction? If you're an animal lover like me, then stay tuned to learn how these beautiful exquisite creatures were almost snuffed out. In the 1890s, the long white feathers of the egret became a fashion accessory for ladies' hats. Hunters began slaughtering birds by the thousands for profit from the market demand. Consequently, egret populations all over the world were being wiped out. In the US, the problem was particularly acute in Florida. Egrets are classified in the plume category. A plume is a special type of bird feather possessed by egrets, ostriches, birds of paradise, pheasants, and peacocks. They often have a decorative or ornamental purpose, commonly used among marching bands and the military, worn on the hat or helmet of the wearer. By the early 1900s, the snowy egret and other wading birds in Florida nearly went extinct because of the plume trade. Demand for plumes for ladies' hats had almost wiped out rookeries along Florida's coasts, not to mention other areas of the country. Birds were slaughtered by the millions for their feathers, which were used to decorate ladies' hats all over the world. In 1902 alone, the London market sold 1,608 packets of plumes, which required the killing of 190,000 egrets. From the trackless jungles of New Guinea around the world both ways to the snow-capped peaks of the Andes, no unprotected bird was safe. The hummingbirds of Brazil, the egrets of the world at large, and rare birds of paradise, the toucan, the eagle, the condor, and the emu, are all being exterminated to swell the annual profits of the millinery trade. The cause is far more serious than the world at large knows or even suspects, but if not for the profits, the birds would be safe, and no unprotected wild species can long escape the hounds of commerce. Plume hunting is the hunting of wild birds to harvest their feathers, especially the more decorative plumes, which are sold for the use of ornamentation, such as aigrets in millinery. An aigrette is a headdress consisting of white egret's feathers or other decorations such as a spray of gems. The movement against the plume trade in the United Kingdom was led by Ida Lemon and other women who led the establishment of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. At the height of the plume bloom in the early part of the 20th century, the business of killing birds for the millinery trade was practiced on a large scale, involving the deaths of hundreds of millions of birds in many parts of the world. London was at the center of the trade in exotic feathers. However, in North America, the heron family was favored due to its indigenous abundance. By the turn of the 20th century, this trade had nearly eliminated egrets in the US, and populations of numerous other bird species around the globe were also approaching extinction. By the late 19th century, plume hunters had nearly wiped out the snowy egret population in the United States. Flamingos, spoonbills, great egrets, and peafowl had also been targeted by plume hunters. The Empress of Germany's bird of paradise was also a popular target of plume hunters as well. But what was pushing this demand for exotic bird feathers? Victorian-era fashion included large hats with wide brims decorated in elaborate creations of silk flowers, ribbons, and exotic plumes. Hats sometimes included entire exotic birds that had been stuffed. Plumage often came from birds in the Florida Everglades, some of which were nearly extinguished by overhunting. Feathered Victorian hats were gorgeous creations thanks to the millions of birds slaughtered in the name of fashion. Feathers had been used in clothing for centuries, but the plume trade escalated from the 1870s through the early 1900s until the most popular species were hunted to the verge of extinction. The most beautiful birds were targeted first, as exotic feathers became highly coveted status symbols. Women sported feathers, wings, and other bird parts on their hats. Tiny hummingbirds were worn as jewelry. Due to this fashion craze, birds were being killed for the millinery trade at the rate of 5 million a year. Many species faced extinction as a result. In the Florida, plume birds were driven away from the most populated areas of the northern part of the state and forced to nest further south. Quarries concentrated in the Everglades area with an abundant food and seasonal dry periods were ideal for nesting birds. By the late 1880s, there was no longer any large numbers of plume birds within reach of Florida's most settled cities. Feathers became the must-have decoration or garments, parasols, muffs, boas, and fans. As the craft of taxidermy advanced, entire birds were displayed. The entire bird is used and is mounted on wires and springs that permit the head and wings to be moved about in the most natural manner. Harper's Bazaar, 1875. By 1899, early environmentalists such as Adeline Knapp were engaged in efforts to curtail the hunting for plumes. By 1900, more than 5 million birds were being killed every year, including 95% of Florida's shorebirds. The most popular plumes came from various species of egret known as little snowies. For their snowy white feathers, even more prized were their breeding plumes, grown during the mating season and displayed by birds during courtship. So-called osprey plumes, actually egret plumes, were used as part of the British Army uniform until they were discontinued in 1889. Poachers often entered the densely populated rookeries where they would shoot and then pluck the roosting birds clean, leaving their carcasses to rot. Unprotected eggs would be easy prey for predators, as were newly hatched birds, who also starved or died from exposure. Millinery was a 17 million a year industry that motivated plume hunters to lay in wait at the nests of egrets and other birds during the nesting season to shoot the parents with small bore rifles and leaving the chicks to starve. By the late 1800s, the plume trade had decimated several species of birds, including flamingos, birds of paradise, and various species of spoonbills. Topping the endangered list were snowy and great egrets, and at one point their pure white feathers were worth more than gold. Hunters decimated rookeries because feathers were most resplendent during mating season. Plumes from the Everglades water birds could be found in Havana, New York City, London, and Paris. Hunters could collect plumes from 100 birds on a good day. In Florida, in an effort to control plume hunting, the American Ornithologists Union and the National Association of Audubon Societies persuaded the Florida state legislation to pass a model non-game bird protection law in 1901. These organizations then employed wardens to protect rookeries, in effect establishing colonial bird sanctuaries. Such public concern combined with the conservation-minded President Theodore Roosevelt led to his Executive Order of President on March 14, 1903, establishing Pelican Island as the first national wildlife refuge in the United States to protect egrets and other birds from extinction by plume hunters. This resulted in the initial federal land specifically set aside for the non-marketable form of wildlife when 3-acre Pelican Island was proclaimed a federal bird reservation in 1903. Following the modest trend beginning with Pelican Island, many other islands and parcels of land and water were quickly dedicated for the protection of various species of colonial nesting birds that were being destroyed for their plumes and other feathers. Such refuge areas include Brenton National Wildlife Refuge in Brenton, Louisiana, established in 1904, Passage Key National Wildlife Refuge in Passage Key, Florida, established in 1905, Shell Keys National Wildlife Refuge in Shell Keys, Louisiana, established in 1907, Key West National Wildlife Refuge in Key West, Florida, established in 1908. Bird City is a private wildfowl refuge or bird sanctuary located on Avery Island in coastal Iberia Parish, Louisiana, founded by the heir of spicy sauce and conservationist Mr. Tobacco Sauce Edward Avery Michelini, whose family owned Avery Island. Michelini established the refuge around 1895 on the 2,200-acre island and a 250-acre estate known eventually as Jungle Gardens because of its lush tropical flora in response to the late 19th century plume hunters. Michelini searched the Gulf Coast and located several surviving egrets, which he took back to his estate on Avery Island. There he turned the birds loose in a type of aviary he called a flying cage, where the birds soon adapted to their new surroundings. In the fall, Michelini set the birds loose to migrate south for the winter. As he'd hoped, the birds returned to Avery Island in the spring, bringing with them even more snowy egrets. This pattern continued until, by 1911, the refuge served as the summer nesting ground for an estimated 100,000 egrets. Because of its early founding an example to others, Theodore Roosevelt, father of American conservation, once referred to Bird City as the most noteworthy reserve in the country. Today, snowy egrets continue to return to Bird City each spring to nest until resuming their migration in the fall. William Hornaday, conservationist and director of the New York Zoological Society, and later the chief taxidermist of the Smithsonian Institute, he was a dedicated activist for the conservation of the American bison and other North American wildlife. Hornaday said that it was common for plume hunters to destroy rookeries for several hundred birds in just 2 or 3 days. Hornaday tirelessly fought against fake feather news. If one believed the news stories of the day, birds were a limitless natural resource and hunting practices were humane. Promoters of the feather trade laminated that wearing feathers and taxidermied whole birds, rapidly increasing numbers of the city dwellers closer to nature, claiming it improved people's awareness and knowledge of the bird species. Many people saw right through this flimsy facade, or fake news, and fought hard to bring truth to the consuming public. Hornaday was one of the strongest critics of the feather trade. In his 1913 book, Our Vanishing Wildlife, Its Extermination and Preservation, he wrote, "It is high time for the whole civilized world to know that many of the most beautiful and remarkable birds of the world are now being exterminated to furnish millinery ornaments for women's hats. The mass of new information that we have recently secured on this traffic for the headquarters of the feather trade is appalling. Previously, I had not deemed that conditions were half as bad as they are." These fake news stories were concocted to hide the gory truth about bird hunting from the public. To combat false information, Hornaday hired an agent to find proof of the true scope of the industry. In order to throw a spotlight on the most recent transactions in the London wild birds plumage market, and to furnish a clear idea of what is today going on in Paris, London, Berlin, and Amsterdam, I will set out in some detail the report of an agent whom I engaged to ascertain the London dealings in the plumage of wild birds that were killed especially to furnish the plumage. As one item, let us take the sales in London in February, May, and October 1911 because they bring the subject well down to date. The sales reports listed 61 birds including gulls, terns, macaws, toucans, owls, emerald-breasted hummingbirds, condors, peacocks, pelicans, herons, and egrets. The feather dealers had deliberately attempted to form an educational list of the most beautiful and the most interesting birds of the world. They could not have done better. That the choicest birds of the whole avian world should be thus blotted out at the beset of vain and heartless women is a shame, a disgrace, and a worldwide loss. The total number of bird corpses auctioned during these 3 sales is as followed: 129,168 egrets, 13,598 herons, 20,698 birds of paradise, 41,090 hummingbirds, 9,464 eagles, condors, etc., 9,472 other birds, a total number of birds 223,490. Hornaday reported that the record number are only the sales of the transactions of 4 companies and don't take into consideration the direct importations of Paris, Berlin, and Amsterdam or manufacturers or other dealers. The full extent of England's annual consumption of the plumage of wild birds slaughtered especially for the trade had never been determined, and Hornaday doubted whether it was possible to ascertain the information. At the height of the plume bloom in the UK around 1901 to 1910, 14,362,000 pounds of exotic feathers were imported into the United Kingdom at a total valuation of 19 million £923,000. A single order of feathers by a London dealer, either a plumassier or a milliner, included 6,000 birds of paradise, 40,000 hummingbirds, and 360,000 various East Indian bird feathers. In 1902, an auction in London sold 1,608 30-ounce packages of heron, including the great heron and egret variety plumes. Each ounce of feathers required the use of 4 herons. Therefore, each package used the feathers of 120 herons for a grand total of 192,960 herons killed. Many people opposed feathered Victorian hats long before any laws were enacted. To counteract the wave of opposition, news stories often downplayed the actual magnitude of the use of feathers. In 1886, ornithologist Frank Chapman from the American Museum of Natural History attempted to debunk these stories by taking a simple head count. In Manhattan, the numbers he discovered was the result of 2 late afternoon walks through the uptown shopping districts, giving an all but incomplete but astounding realization of the staggering number of species destroyed and the relative numbers of each. 700 hats were counted. 20 different bird species recognized. 543 were decorated with feathers of some sort. The percentage of hats with feathers 77%. Percentage of hats without feathers 10%. Chapman spotted 40 native bird species, but the birds were not flittering through the streets. They were being killed and for the most part plucked, disassembled or stuffed, and painstakingly positioned on 3/4 of the hats he saw. 7 grebes, 5 blue jays, 21 common terns, 23 cedar waxwings, 9 northern orioles. In 1900, Chapman changed the tradition of the Christmas side hunt, in which people competed for the highest number of birds slaughtered. Instead, he proposed the Christmas bird count, in which people counted birds instead of killing them. The first Victorian Christmas bird count, or the CBC, was a huge success, with 27 volunteers counting birds in the United States and Canada. It continues every Christmas season to this day. In November 1902, Dr. Pearson took a bill to the North Carolina legislature which called for the first protection of song and insectivorous birds in America. It was reported favorably by a subcommittee which invited the keen-eyed Quaker teacher to address the legislature. He did, and made the first of those addresses, and argued with unsentimental, brilliant, hard-hitting defenses for bird protection. The law was carried by a vote of only 2, but it was carried. He also made his addresses for bird protection in North Carolina. Nothing happened immediately, except that he was sent for in a hurry to help put some bird laws through the Tennessee legislature. He went to Tennessee, made his speech, and the laws were passed. By this time, ornithologists and practical birdmen had heard that things were stirring. In 1904, Sir Albert Wilcox of New York decided to incorporate an organization for the protection of wildlife in America. He heard about the young Quaker teacher in North Carolina and sent for him. Dr. Pearson sat through a meeting in New York in which papers were read on the destruction of giraffes in Africa. He made his own addresses, which was full of nothing but facts about the destruction of songbirds in America, of robins sold for food in Philadelphia markets, and for the wholesale destruction of gulls and terns for feathers, the shipping of gull eggs by the schooner loads to public markets, and finally of the killing of the almost unthought of egrets for the arrogets that were everywhere then on women's hats. On the 2nd of January 1905, the National Association of Audubon Societies was incorporated. Dr. Pearson began his own war on the plume hunting and poaching industry, and almost immediately a war which was to reach the headlines and front pages of the New York papers, a war in which resounded from New York to Albany, Pittsburgh to Washington. Its echo could be heard in the egret rookeries of Florida and the milliner shops of Paris and London. It wasn't until 1910 that the Audubon Societies were able to present a bill to the New York legislature which would stop the sale of plumes. The elected president president of the society was Mr. William Dutcher. Under Mr. Dutcher's leadership, with the active efforts and untiring stimulus of Dr. Pearson, Audubon societies were formed all over the country. Thousands of leaflets on birds and on egrets were written and described. The National Association was growing into a body of American public opinion to be reckoned with. The egret was Dr. Pearson's most constant concern. Time after time, he made trips to Florida to learn more about them. The truth was all that he wanted, and he found it. He tramped, waded, and pulled a boat through the almost entirely unknown Everglades of Florida. He slept in the campfires of plume hunters. He nursed a family of fishermen and plume hunters in an epidemic on the west coast of Florida, and was in turn nursed by them when he broke a hip. He fished with the natives and studied endlessly the fascinating rookeries of all kinds of water birds. The information he extracted was written into the Audubon Society leaflets and sent about the country. It was almost the first time that the general public had ever heard of the egret rookeries. They knew only arrogets, the exquisite white feathers which were gracing the hats of high-class, distinguished women everywhere. But back in 1910, when the National Association of Audubon Societies and Dr. Pearson began to strive to make the selling of plumes illegal, 16,000 milliners rose up to declare such a law beyond all bounds of reason. They had $20 million invested in feathers and plumes. They said it was only a bunch of cranks and sentimentalists and school teachers who wanted to interfere with the free people's legitimate business. The milliners packed up and went to Albany. Dr. Pearson also went up to Albany for the Audubon societies. The milliners had no attorney, but Dr. Pearson made his addresses and was granted a hearing by Governor Hughes. The bill went through without the loss of a single vote on either house. The milliners opened branch offices in Philadelphia, and the fight was transferred to Pennsylvania. The milliners used the same argument they used in New York with the same methods of attack. But Dr. Pearson went to the legislature in Pennsylvania, and the same thing happened. The bill passed without any opposition. The law in New York was to have gone into effect on the 1st of July the following year. In January, on midnight of the day before, Dr. Pearson received word from Albany that the legislature was about to repeal the act. He gathered himself and his forces, took the train to Albany, and licked the milliners for the last time by a few votes. In 1913, the Audubon societies started a movement in Congress to prohibit the importation of feathers in the bodies of wild birds, and so after years of campaigning, there was at last a federal law. For a while, there was a great deal of public indignation, strange as that may seem now. The customs authorities took the arrogets off hats of women returning from abroad. 4 chests of plumes, meaning thousands of them, were taken from women's hats by customs officials the next year. But public sentiment was gradually creeping around to a feeling of shame about dead birds being used as fashion accessories. A Mrs. Hollis, a writer on Dress and Beauty, once said, "Smashed birds or a corpse is never a really pleasant ornament." As opposition to feathered Victorian hats escalated, poachers in the plume trade were bristling their ruffled feathers and decided to try to promote innovative new campaigns. Even with mounting pressure, the plume industry stood fast against claims of cruelty and offered the public false assurances. Industry officials claimed that the bulk of the feather collection was limited to shed plumes. However, in truth, those dead plumes brought only 1/5 of the price of the live, unblemished ones. To counteract the charges of cruelty, claims were circulated that most feather trim was either artificial or produced on foreign farms that exported molted feathers. They claimed that birds were no longer being killed to obtain feathers. Instead, hunters were picking molted feathers up off the ground, but in reality, throughout Australia, India, and the Orinoco and Amazon basin, the quality of plumage gathered during the molt was minute, and the majority of feathers arriving in London were virtually all from shot birds. The poachers obviously thought people were really dumb, because after all, not very many Victorian women were tramping around the Everglades in pursuit of her hat ornamentation. In South America and in the Caribbean, bird protection didn't exist in any form either. Probably the worst example of that, beyond the plume hunters of Venezuela, is the destruction of the flamingo that exists in Cuba. Cuba is one of the largest flamingo rookeries, for they don't breed in the United States, but migrate to Florida, where they too were hunted due to no protection laws. Only a small percentage of flamingos found near Florida nest in the uninhabited island off of the shore of the Bahamas. Virginia Woolf, in her push for the plumage bill, proceeds to paint a harsh portrait of the unthinking, self-indulgent woman of fashion, but in another twist, she renders a more devastating portrait of men, the hunters and merchants that turn killing into a commodity, and the male parliament that fails to pass the plumage bill prohibiting the trade. Woolf prompts her audience to question the social code that unconsciously condemns women's pleasures, the love of beauty and fashion, as a sin, whereas men's pleasures of lust for hunting, women, and money are accepted or even valorized. Can it be that of a greater sin to be unjust to women than to torture birds? The Victorian lady's existence as a consumer, and a flawlessly finished consumer icon at that, was partly the work of women, producers of luxury goods or services. For example, in 1889 in London and Paris, over 8,000 women were employed in the millinery trade, and the majority of the 83,000 people employed in the New York City in 1900 in the making and decorating of hats were women. A class-bound Virginia Woolf may have been ignorant of this point, or more likely intentionally ignorant to it, so she could highlight the male producers and profiteers controlling the trade. The Plumage Act entered the statute book a year later in 1921, a bill to prohibit the sale, hire, or exchange of the plume and skins of certain wild birds. The Plumage Act was celebrated as the factor that brought an end to the age of extermination. How much this change was due to the effects of hunting and trade regulations, or that a growing inclination towards promoting humanitarian ideals reduced the allure of feathered garb, is not clear. What is clear is that dwindling feather sales had much to do, if not more, with changes in the everyday lives of women, which simply eliminate opportunities to wear oversized feathered hats. So what did ever happen to all the bird species affected by murderous millinery or women's Edwardian hat fashion? While countless species were targeted for their feathers, luckily all the efforts of William Hornaday, William Dutcher, Frank Chapman, Dr. Pearson, and even Virginia Woolf's input helped to put bird protection laws in place, and right where they needed to be. Since the egret species seemed to be the most sought after, I'm happy to report that salvation waited in the wings with the prohibition of the plume trade. By 1910 to 1913, the snowy egret and other egret varieties managed to recover their numbers in most regions, and reached peak numbers between the 1930s to the 1950s. But most importantly of all, leading the flock were some of the most influential men and women and conservationists in America and Europe.